Rabbinic protocol requires that one be poteach b'kavod achsanya, which roughly translates to one should begin by acknowledging the graciousness of one's hosts. When it comes to the Hildebrand project, my host here this week, it is a very happy duty to acknowledge that graciousness. I'm going to say a very personalist thing. I think I've been taken care of both in body and spirit. Now that sounds very hackneyed and very generic, but if you know anything about Orthodox Jewry, you'll know that living here for the past couple of days in Steubenville, Ohio, I'm a very high maintenance figure because anyone who has to walk around campus with a little bag of fig bars to keep kosher, as well as being the beneficiary of the wonderful meals that get shipped in from Pittsburgh, thanks to Catherine and the wonderful staff here at the Hildebrand Project. So you know that when I say I'm being taken care of both in body and spirit, I don't mean that casually or in a hackneyed, generic way. It's the real deal. I'm very inspired. I hope this doesn't flatter. You did a good job, John Henry, of embarrassing me. So I'm going to embarrass you and the pater familias, the wonderful professor, John Crosby, such a gentleman. And really all of you, frankly. I have been so impressed. It's very clear from the get-go when you see me, I am an other at an event like this. It's true. I'm an Orthodox Jew, rabbi. I'm an other. But in true personalist spirit, the incredible welcome that I've received, the incredible warmth and the dignity accorded to me, feeling the otherness of my being an other, not diminishing that. We are people of faith here. We don't buy into the secularist lie that the only way to communicate with another human being in this world is by essentially tearing away the most essential elements of our identities through some Rawlsian veil of ignorance. We don't believe that as men and women of spirit. So we all come to this event as individuals, but we also come as kindred spirits. That's why we're here at this wonderful program. But I want to let you know how grateful I am that I feel that I've been so embraced in my otherness, perhaps even because of my otherness, and yet I have felt so welcomed and so a part of this amazing community. I love the fact that nobody stayed late for my lecture because everybody went to Mass. I would have been disappointed had anybody stayed back, I promise you. But to be in a room of 80, 90 faithful Christians and one Orthodox Jew is actually a beautiful thing. And it could be a model for the best that the West can offer in a very challenging time culturally and theologically. So by way of introduction, I say thank you to all of you for being here and for making this such a spirited event, and of course to John Henry and to the leadership of the Hildebrand Project for putting this all together. The project that I've been engaged in the past couple of days has essentially been a narrative, really, telling a story of two Jewish thinkers of the mid-20th century, two transitional figures, Central and Eastern European figures, one born in Poland, one born in Transylvania, in 1908 when Rabbi Berkowitz was born. It was then the Austro-Hungary Empire, Catholic monarchy still. These figures move from Eastern and Central Europe to the West. They eventually make their way from Eastern Europe to Berlin. They both study in the University of Berlin in the mid to late 20s. And then through various movements and fleeing and salvation, really, they get to the shores of the United States. I don't tell you this biography merely to give you the historical account, although I think that's valuable with thinkers like Soloveitchik and Berkowitz in a setting like this, because I know probably a handful of you had heard of Soloveitchik before this program. I'd be very surprised if anybody heard of Berkowitz before this program. And what's interesting is that Berkovits is unfortunately understudied and underappreciated in the Orthodox Jewish community. And I could speculate why that's the case, but perhaps something to do with his more progressive views on Jewish law, Jewish halacha. It could have something to do with his institutional home not being as significant as Soloveitchik's, who was at the heart of American Orthodox Jewry in New York City and in Boston. But what I want to do today is sketch Rabbi Berkowitz's contribution to a Jewish sexual ethic, another layer, another chapter, if you will, in this narrative of Jewish contributions to theological anthropology. And I want to, beyond sharing some of these biographical details, which I think a good personalist can appreciate. Personalists love the particular. We prefer the instantiation of the individual rather than the abstract universal. And I think the history of each of these figures that we've been studying can really be more than just anecdotal or more than just historical. They can give us a sense of the elan, the lifeblood of these thinkers. The way the Hungarians and Romanians are different than the Poles, and the Poles and Hungarians are different than the Germans, and then both of those are different from the Italians. There is something to this, but Berkowitz becomes a thinker in his own right in the 30s. As I said, he traveled to the University of Berlin, where at the time the lineup of thinkers, both students, common students or colleagues of his, peers of his, as well as the professors and the teachers, was incredible. I'll just read the faculty in Berlin when both Berkowitz and Soloveitchik studied. Ernst Cassirer, Carl Schmitt, Werner Sombart, Werner Heisenberg, Erwin Schrödinger. Those are the faculty. The students, Herbert Marcuse, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Abraham Joshua Heschel, another Jewish theologian that some of you may have heard of, could also be in this little company of Jewish theological anthropologists. Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who would go on to become the Lubavitcher, the great rabbi of the Lubavitcher Chabad community. And of course, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, who is an older contemporary, an older peer of Berkowitz. Berkowitz then spent some time in the pulpit. He was a pastor. He was an actual congregational rabbi, in addition to being a theologian. He went from Berlin. He escaped really by the skin of his teeth, like the von Hildebrand story from Austria. He barely escapes. He makes it to Leeds, England, where he serves during the end of the war and for a little bit into the late 40s. He then makes his way finally from Leeds to Australia. Anthony, this is a shout out to the Australians. He was in Sydney, however, the other great Australian city. And from Sydney, he moves to Boston, and there was a little bit of an overlap just geographically with Soloveitchik. But then he finally moves, his final journey in the United States was to Chicago, where he became the chairman of the philosophy department of a very small rabbinical college known as the Hebrew Theological College in Skokie, Illinois. And in 1976, he moves to Jerusalem, Israel, and from 76 until his death in 1992, he becomes simply a writer, ongoing theological work. He writes over 19 books in his lifetime. He was quite prolific. And there's a kind of empirical strain in his writings. Those of you who read the Soloveitchik with me yesterday, there's a distinct methodological difference between these writers. If you've read both passages, you can, I think, feel it right away. The Berkowitz is much homier, much more engaging, much more immediate, much more empirical. Berkowitz was more of a halachic empiricist than Soloveitchik, who was really a halachic phenomenologist. For Berkowitz, Jewish law is vital. As an Orthodox rabbi, that's kind of doctrinally necessary for us to understand who he was. But he saw Hume as a great mentor, at least in his view of how to understand the world, how to understand reality. So he had a kind of a Humean empirical side to him, whereas Soloveitchik was much more influenced by the Neo-Kantian Marburg school of Hermann Cohen, and in a different way, the phenomenologist Shaler. I think that actually gets played out from the very beginning of this essay. If you look with me, the essay begins, this is an essay that was written in 1976, and it's a Jewish sexual ethics. And he's kind of setting the stage. The context of this essay is, as you would expect, it's 1976, the last legs of the sexual revolution, the last vestiges, the kind of, it's schlepping along, it's kind of, eventually it will consume itself in some way, but it's still very much in the life, the life stream or the cultural air. The sexual revolution is still quite pronounced. And as you see, he quotes who was then quite popular, this psychoanalyst and scholar, intellectual historian Norman Brown, sort of a Freudian Marxist, not a great guy, but he's trying to make a case that the sexual revolution is the natural consequence of a view of sexuality that has been regnant, has been dominant for at least 1,000 years in the West. And there are hints, there are little vestiges of a critique of Christianity here. I don't know if any of you felt this, but essentially, and this is Berkowitz, to the best of my knowledge, never read von Hildebrand. I wish he had in some ways, because I think it would have been a more nuanced account of his views of the body and how the body is embraced in Christianity, certainly in personalist thought. But look at what he essentially says is the outgrowth of European culture, the shattering of the tablets of the law, also the direct result of this meta-science. Meta-science, again, he betrays his empiricist leanings. Meta-science, the empiricists would say meta-science, the phenomenologist would probably say a worldview or Weltanschauung, something that is a little less scientific or scientifically oriented. But the worldview of the West has included the shattering of the tablets of the law. It's also the direct result of this meta-science and the subsequent relativization of all values. It led, in fact, to a destruction of all standards, with man walled in on all sides by absurdity. As if it were not enough, modern psychology completed the reduction of man to that level of an animal. So he's essentially describing the worldview of naturalism, materialism, reductionism. And this is what the 60s is a response. In some ways, it's both a response to and the product of. And he's offering an alternative. He's offering a counter-narrative to the sexual liberation ethics of the 60s in Jewish law. But he definitely believes, as someone who took the pulse of society through its realization in real historical development, in real societal change, he worried about what he perceived to be a delegitimization of the body in traditional Christian writing. And I only wish, as I said, that had he read von Hildebrand, had he read John Paul, he may have had a very different conception of where Christianity is in this story. Because as I've suggested yesterday and today, there's a much more parallel story between the Jewish narrative around sexual ethics and the personalist Catholic one. But this is the backdrop. This is he starts with an empirical social problem, namely the 60s and the sexual revolution, and he now offers this counter-narrative. And the counter-narrative really begins in earnest in section 2. And he basically says that every good Jewish philosophy or every good Jewish theory has to start with foundational principles. And what are the Jewish foundational principles that undergird the Jewish sexual ethic? And he identifies 2 presuppositions. And what are those 2 presuppositions? The first is one of creation as gift. The idea that the world as created, the cosmos as created by God, is good and it is a gift. And I want to break that down. I think there are two corollaries of this claim that creation is a gift. The first is the inherent goodness in the creation. And again, as a Jewish thinker, Berkowitz is not going to invoke the notion of original sin. He's not going to invoke a notion of a depravity of the cosmos due to human sin. It is inherent goodness from the Creator. That's one corollary of the creation as gift. And the other is that there's a certain functionality, a certain purposiveness, a certain teleology that human sexuality points towards. I would take both of these two principles, the inherent goodness of the creation and the purposiveness of creation, and I think that yields a kind of third term, and that is man as a microcosm. What does that mean? Berkovits claims that man in his totality, man in his fullness of being, not just rationality, and this is very reminiscent of what Dr. Smith was talking about yesterday, that unlike the Thomist, and it's also the Maimonidean, it's the rationalist, the medieval rationalist from the Aristotelian legacy, unlike that tradition, the Thomist or the Maimonidean tradition, the tradition that Berkovits is a part of, as Soloveitchik, really takes in the totality of human activity, the totality of human functionality, the totality of human faculties. So he goes on to say, I think very beautifully, that, and this is a kind of almost like an empiricist, again, I say empiricist in quotation marks. It's not empiricist in a naturalist sense, but he's saying, look at on the bottom of page 70, he says that man's humanity, or in the middle of page 70, man's humanity is not something derived, an epiphenomenon of his animality. It is as originally given as his instinctual equipment and biological frame. Because of that, man's animality too is human. Whereas the secularist of today animalizes the human, Judaism humanizes the so-called animal. And then he goes down to make this, what I'm claiming in quotation marks, as an empirical deduction, notwithstanding all the theological problems of anthropomorphism, the notion of describing God's actions and being in human terms, presented by the concept, it is the whole man, body and mind, instinct and spirit, that was created in God's image, and as such, in its complex entirety, represents that image on this earth. Nor is this just teaching, unrelated to man's experience. Empiricism. It is more than doubtful that the reduction of man does justice to his existential reality. The reductionist theories are contradicted by the daily behavior of the human being. Man not only desires instinctively, and not only does he reason as a rational being, but he wills, he plans, he chooses, he accepts responsibility, and creates. And here we get our first introduction to the centrality of creation in the Jewish theological anthropology. One of the principal or cardinal Jewish values, it's a mitzvah, it's one of the 613 commandments of the Jewish Torah, is imitatio Dei, v'halachta bidrachav, to walk in God's ways. Well, what's the first description that we get of the God of the Hebrew Bible? He's a creator. So if God's first act is creation, then if you take imitatio Dei seriously, then the human being, by divine charge, by divine, almost not fiat, but divine law and meaning, has an obligation to create. So the act of human creativity is underscored in this theological account precisely because of these twin principles of God creating a world that is good, inherently good, and God creating man in God's own image. So God is creating man in his image, and it's not just an image of rationality, of pure abstraction, pure universality. It is willing, creating, being, feeling, emoting, having relations in a relational stance towards another. And the creativity becomes an extremely central view in both Berkovitz's thought and in Soloveitchik's thought as well. Okay, what are now that we've laid out these theological foundations or these theological presuppositions, creation is good, the inherent goodness of creation, the notion that man is created in the image of God, what are the consequences for a Jewish sexual ethic? Now that we've laid out the foundations, those two primary foundations, what are the results or the consequences for our theory of sexual being or sexual identity. You'll see, again, another sort of tip of the hat of the difference between Berkowitz's orientation and Soloveitchik's. That phrase biopsychic personality or biopsychic unity, it's kind of clunky, kind of a little bit scientific, a little bit too empirical. Soloveitchik would never use that term. He would speak much more of the person or the personality or the human. But in Judaism, what is the result of this? There's no denigration of the body whatsoever. And again, I can't help but being part of engaging a thoughtful Catholic or Christian audience is finding the spaces where we can share and see the commensurability of our distinct views. But it's also, if one's honest and one is true to yourself and true to the tradition, you have to point out places where there are departures in our traditions. For Berkowitz, there is the unstated here, but subtle suggestion that in Judaism, there is not any allowance for the denigration of the body. I'm no expert in church doctrine or the history of church doctrine, but I would pose to all of you, how revolutionary are von Hildebrand and Wojtyła when it comes to a Christian theological anthropology around sexuality? How radical or revolutionary is it to talk about both the procreative and the unitive dimensions to the sexual congress? Whereas for someone like Berkowitz and Soloveitchik, they inherit this sense that there's a kind of discomfort at times with the body. And I would just, again, open it, and I'd love to maybe in our chance for conversation soon, to be pushed back and say, Mark, you got the history all wrong. I'd welcome that. I think it's a polemical strategy. Jews have been burdened for almost 2 millennia with the idea that we're Pharisees. We love the law, but so we have our own kind of little tropes that kind of, in a polemical context, when you're thinking theology or philosophy, that we tend to trot out, and they get a little hackneyed and long in the tooth, and they're not all that accurate. But they serve perhaps some purpose. But I think what we can say is von Hildebrand and Wojtyła dramatically alter the terrain, and this kind of subtle suggestion wouldn't really get off the ground much, from where they think it is right now. Look at the line on 71. Again, he's got this clunky phrase, because of this psychosomatic unity. Again, the psychosomatic unity, it would be the personalist, unity of the person itself. You wouldn't even need the unity per se. A denial of either one of them is a betrayal of both. In other words, a denial of the spirit or the body is a betrayal of both the spirit and the body. Very reminiscent of Emmanuel Mounier, great French personalist's notion of I am my body, I'm not only my body. And you get the sense of both elements being critical for one's theory of the whole person. But he articulates it. Articulates it quite beautifully. Another thing that's worth pointing out, despite what we've now suggested is a trope of Judaism's embrace of the body, Judaism never allowing denigration of the body. In the Catholic tradition, you don't have stories of the rabbis or the pious ones or the saints that are struggling with another woman or a woman with a man with their sexual libido, with their urges. You have some, I think, fascinating conversion stories and some stories that, when we get to Berkowitz's narrative theology, that wonderful story in the Talmud, which is so rich and could really unpack it. To me, I did think of, the woman who goes to the patroness or the matroness here, or the harlot. That there's going to be some conversion story parallels. But as a Jew, as a religious and religious in the technical term. I'm a rabbi, so the idea that there could be a story about my engagement with sexuality that will show, and he says in a very stark formulation, that Freud could not show anything new to the rabbis of the Talmud about the libido. It's a great line, it's like a funny line. But the truth of the line is that the struggle concretely, in terms of real, the human engagement with sexuality, both as temptation and as source of ultimate, transcendence, is something that you could tell the story with a rabbi. What does that do pedagogically when you model that, when you can't do the same thing so readily with a saint that is a cleric or a saint that's a religious, because it doesn't have the same resonance. It would be unseemly. It would not promote spiritual devotion. It would be something, uncomfortable or awkward or feeling sinful. So just the sociological and the religious divide between Judaism and Christianity when it comes to the sexual life of the religious, of the clerics, of the rabbis, it has a different feel when you're reading, this essay of Berkovitz and you're getting to all these stories of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Chia, the Chassid, the pious one. It's just, I can't think of a parallel in the Catholic tradition. That could be because of the paucity and my limitations. But it would be interesting, because as a pedagogical matter, to if you're trying to convey the sense that sexuality, when channeled in the holy and proper pursuit of the good, is something that we can engage. If you don't have the models, if you don't have the sort of the role models, maybe the answer is that you have lay role models, and that's a pretty adequate answer as far as I'm concerned. But it promotes a different kind of sensibility. I want to turn on, to me, the most interesting section from a theoretical and theological point of view is section 4, which really could be called personalizing the impersonal. And he has this wonderful theory, which then becomes the basis of his interpretation of the Talmudic tale. He begins with a really interesting question: Can sexuality ever be impersonal? And what he makes a claim is that sexuality, we are acted upon by sexuality, the impersonal force in the universe, which at its most generic level is a natural, not a redeemed sexuality. It's a natural urge. It's akin to the biological urge of other animals. It's akin to, in the vegetative world, pollination. The unredeemed, the purely natural sexual instinct, the challenge in Judaism is to transform that, to make the impersonal into the radically personal. And how do you do that? So Rabbi Berkovitz has a couple of theories here, a couple of ways in. Look on the top of page 73. Unless one sees clearly how the sexual union, the crudely impersonal, calls for its accommodation within the most fundamentally personal, one fails to understand the nature of human sexuality. That sexual union is essentially the transformation of what's natural in an unredeemed state to what is fundamentally the most personal, the most intimate, the most human in the world, through the transformation of the urge to a personal encounter, to a personal union. Look a little bit further down on page 73 has another, I think, a beautiful formulation here. In the context of the most intimately personal, the impersonality of the sexual impulse becomes, due to its incomparable energy and driving power, there's something raw, there's something that's elemental in the sexual urge and the sexual power when it's not conditioned or humanized, when it's not made into the personal. But when it's at this state of the raw or elemental, due to its incomparable energy and driving power, the most self-regarding and the most antisocial of impulses, which man has to personalize. At its core, it is the most destructive and antisocial when it's not redeemed, when it's not channeled into a personal source or a personal receptivity. And then going down, it may therefore very well be that how man deals with personalizing the impersonal in his sex life is the core of all human morality. In other words, that one could suggest that the way one encounters the other in one's sexuality, that is the defining factor of the human. That what makes us most human and how we're judged in terms of our achieving that humanity is how we have either succeeded or failed to transform that impersonal, antisocial sexual urge, which, remember, the Talmud says that without the sexual urge, there could not be any commerce, there could not be any human discourse besides sexuality. That there is something preternatural about the sexual urge, but that must be channeled, that must be chastened, that must be made into the personal. The Talmud goes so far as to say that creation is good, that if you look in the Bible, in the opening verses, chapter 1, that God created and it was good. Well, in one instance, it says, Tov Ma'od, very good. You're cheating. I'm teasing. Tov Ma'od, and it says, Bishnei Yitzrecha, with both of your urges, with your good urge and your evil urge. You serve God, and that is considered good by God. Because in its core, it is the source of how one can be most human. It is the source from the material of the impersonal, antisocial sexuality. You can actually build the most human life through that social, that transformation to the personal. It should be obvious by now that the fundamental principle of the sexual ethics, of the Jewish sexual ethics, is to personalize the impersonal. Okay, let's move on to what I consider, I think, the highlight of this essay, and it's what I call Berkowitz's narrative theology. You know, what's original, when you think about narrative theology, you might think of people like Stanley Hauerwas. You think about the influence of MacIntyre. There's the application to the biblical world of thought, biblical theology, but narrative, and there are many narrative parts of the Bible. You know, Jews, we love the law, as you know, but we also love a great story. Some of you have read Buber, you know, the tales of the Hasidism. There are a lot of great Jewish stories. The story that Berkowitz tells here is from the Talmud. This is a 2,000-year-old story. It's actually the Talmud, when Dr. Smith yesterday made that beautiful identification of parents as co-creators. Well, the Talmud says 2,000 years ago that there are three partners. There are three shutfin. Shutfin is the Aramaic word for partner, business partner even. There are three shutfin in every human being. The Father, the Mother, and the Shekhinah, the divine presence. So the Talmud is a great resource for a theological narrative. We normally think of theological narratives within the biblical, when there's law and there's narrative. But the Talmud, the rabbinic Torah, the oral Torah, is also a great source of theological insight, theological value. And here, you know, we get this incredible story, right? We get this story of this young Torah student who sees a well-known harlot. You know, I guess there were well-known harlots back in those days. And he pays 400 silver pieces, and he travels across the seas. It's not a momentary lust. It's much deeper. It's much more consuming. And there are, as the Talmud relates, there are 7 beds that are prepared, 6 of silver and 1 of gold. And they're arranged one above the other. and that there's a ladder between each of them. The highest bed, of course, being made of the gold. And then she climbs up to the top and she lays down naked in the golden bed. And then he too, this young Torah scholar, climbs up to sit beside her in the nude. And then at that very moment, right before consummation, the tzitziot, the fringes, the 4 fringes of his garb came and slapped him across the face. I'm going to show you some real live tzitziot. See? I mean, you guys have rosaries and you have other wonderful things. So this is one fringe of a 4-fringed garment that is an under, I'm not Opus Dei. So, so the tzitziot, the fringes, slap him across the face. They're animated. They slap him across the face. And at that moment, he's totally shaken. He's shaken out of this demonic possession that he's been in, and he stops cold in his tracks. And then he goes to sit down on the ground. He sits on the ground, and then she too comes and sits on the ground. And she says to him, "By the capital of Rome." That's interesting, It's not the whore of Babylon, but it's, "I shall not let you off until you tell me what blemish you saw in me." She thinks that somehow he lost his ardor for her, that somehow he's no longer attracted to her. But that's not the case at all. Said he to her, "I swear I have never seen a woman as beautiful as you. But there is a commandment that God commanded us, and its name is tzitzit, the fringes. The words in which it is written contain the phrase, 'I am the eternal your God,' twice, meaning I am the one who calls to account. I am the one who will reward. Now the tzitziot appeared to me as they were 4 witnesses." Because in Jewish tradition, the verses in Numbers, where the law of tzitzit is commanded, says, "You shall not stray after your heart and after your eyes. Lo sasuru achrei levavchem v'achrei einechem." And so it's appropriate that the tzitzit become his salvation, that they become the means of which he's saved from this terrible temptation and this terrible sin. And she's amazed. This harlot, this high-priced harlot, is amazed. "I will not let you away. I will not let you go, and you tell me the name, your name, the name of your city, the name of your rabbi, and the name of the school where you study Torah." He wrote it all down and placed it into her hand. She's about to convert. She's going to divide her property. She divides her property into 3 parts, a third for the government, a third for the poor, thank God, and a third she took with her, apart from the bed linen, the linen in her bed. And she goes to the study house, to the Torah house of Rabbi Chia, the master. "Rabbi, command me that I be made a convert." And the story goes on, and it's so beautiful that the conversation, the dialogue between the rabbi, the senior rabbi, and this harlot, it repeats, "What did he ask you?" And again, she hands to him in his hand this piece of paper with the names, his name, the name of his rabbi, the name of his town, the name of his study hall. And she converts. And the rabbi marries them. See, that wouldn't happen in a non-Jewish conversion story. That there's this salvation, she converts, and then they get married. And here, I'll just quickly, it's just incredible. Within this Talmudic tale, you have the elements of the sexual ethic, this theological anthropology that Berkovitz presented to us. The first is this irrepressible force of sexual instinct, that the sexual power in man is not to be ignored, it's not to be spiritualized, it's to be reckoned with as a serious, the creative, the natural dimension of creativity in the world, that universalistic dimension of creativity in the world. Of course, that's not enough, but that's where we start. It's not a momentary temptation. There's something deeper than just lust here. There's something deeper. It's a lust, but it comes with things of dignity. It comes with other associations of pride or honor, other elements. It's wrapped, it's bundled together. It's not just lust, and it's certainly not just a momentary lust. He is possessed. The tzitzit become the vehicle, the fringes become the vehicle for his salvation, precisely because they are agents of not following one's temptations, not following one's heart and one's eyes. Sitting on the ground, they sit down on the ground, they humble themselves, they remove themselves from that high standing, that artificial high standing of the high-priced call girl, the beds of linen and gold. They sit on the ground. She says to him, he says to her. These are all tokens of the redemption from impersonality. All these elements in the story, every detail of the story is another layer of the transformation from the impersonal to the personal. And then I would say two or three final things. Beauty is maintained. Beauty is not denigrated. The beauty that attracted this student to the woman is redeemed, it's elevated. They are married, they are blessed. Beauty is a good, is a human good. It's a personalist good. The idea here, it's so beautiful, on page 79, the idea that all of the Jewish law, all of the Torah, both its legal and its narrative forms, are all building towards this transformation from the impersonal to the personal. On page 79 on the left-hand column, within this Jewish sexual ethics, one should replace the term inhibition with that of discipline. Inhibition imposed upon a creature of now is oppression. In other words, inhibition imposed upon a creature who only lives in a materialist now or in a sexual liberation now or without the horizons of eternity, that's oppression. While discipline chosen by the future-oriented man, the man of agency and freedom, is liberation. One liberates oneself. It says in the chapters of the Fathers that the Torah, don't read it that they were engraved, charut, but read it cherut. They make you free. The law will set you free. The law will set you free. Little polemic there. I'm teasing. There's a lot more to say. This essay just scratches the surface. There's a wonderful, very provocative approach to the question of divorce, which we discussed a little bit yesterday in our treatment of Rabbi Soloveitchik. Obviously, divorce is an institute in Mosaic law. It's an institution of Mosaic law, which the Talmud again says that, God forbid, when divorce happens, the altar weeps. But for Berkovitz, as you saw, and Soloveitchik, there are times when the relationship becomes impersonal, when it becomes so reductively impersonal, when there's a betrayal, where there's that adultery, either actual adultery or an adultery even of the heart, where one loses one sense of the other and that relationship, where Mosaic law would either require or permit divorce. And I think Berkovitz, a little bit more empirical than Soloveitchik, says that there are just a lot of clearly miserable people who are not just miserable because they haven't tried, but because that personality has deteriorated, that relationship, that union has become impersonal. It returned back to that sexual, impersonal, universalistic, that's not personal. We also, Jews, have a different notion of sanctity. There's not a sacramental dimension to marriage. Whereas Catholics have a sacramental notion of marriage. Holiness in the Jewish tradition is contracted by human obedience to the will of God, to the law, and that's when holiness is created. But I think in closing, before we open up for some questions, I would just say that thinkers like Berkovitz and Soloveitchik are wonderful windows into a rich literature that Catholics and Christians that share in this personalist tradition, without converting. I sometimes get asked, boy, you love Catholicism so much. Well, how come, well, what's going on? That did not happen here yet. So personalists are less susceptible to that for the obvious reasons that you might gather. But by studying thinkers like Soloveitchik and Berkovitz, you can actually see a tradition which is 2,000 years old that has the resources to tell you or to share with you a kind of narrative theology, a kind of account of man and woman that can support and can deepen your own wonderful writings and your own tradition. And so, in the very humble, ecumenical spirit of feeling that we can be kindred spirits, but we also know where we part company and where the other remains another, I think beautiful things can happen, and especially in the spirit of personalism. So thank you all very, very much.